So we'll get started now and I'll continue to let folks in. But thank you so much to everyone who registered and joined us today for the National Housing Council Review Panel, How to Make Your Submission with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and the Accessible Housing Network. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, and I encourage everyone to fill in the chat where you're calling in from and your own land acknowledgement, should you like. But I'm calling in from Vancouver on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And at the Women's Network, we like to acknowledge that the current homelessness crisis disproportionately impacts Indigenous people and is a direct result of colonial and patriarchal policies that has dispossessed Indigenous folks of their lands and homes and commodified land, which has led to the homelessness crisis and housing crisis that we see today. We have our agenda here. So we're going to be saving Q&A to the end of today's uh, webinar, pardon me, and I will be fielding questions as we go. If you want to add questions to the chat, please do so, but we'll be making time at the end. So we will have a little bit about us, the Right to Housing Roadmap, talk about the NEHA review panel, the importance of making submission, and the 5 questions that the National Housing Council review panel is asking for, and then the Q&A. So my name is Stefania. I'm the Executive Director of Advocacy and Communications at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. And we are a network focused on the elimination of homelessness and housing insecurity for women, girls, trans, two-spirit, and gender diverse people across Canada. And we do this through research, policy advocacy, community engagement, human rights work, and strategic litigation. And we also work with a lot of incredible partners such as the Accessible Housing Network. And I'm going to pass it over to Kate to introduce her network.
Hi, my name's Kate Chung, and I'm the co-founder of the Accessible Housing Network, which now has over 70 organizations as members right across the country. We have member organizations everywhere except Yukon. If you've got contacts in Yukon, please tell them about us. We'd love to have them join us. And we're advocating that all new housing be required to be universal design, fully accessible to anybody of any age or ability. They've done this in Australia, so we're saying, why not Canada?
Thanks, Kate. And I'll also pass it over to Sherry Caldwell with the Childhood Disability Network Canada.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, I'm Sherry Caldwell, and I co-founded the Childhood Disability Network of Canada because we're very concerned about women that are lifetime caregivers to children with disabilities being excluded from all federal policies and the human rights crisis that is happening to women and caregivers. Due to this, there's no funding to stay home and raise your child. That is often a full-time job, and it goes for your entire life. So we put together some asks of the federal government so that these voices could be heard. And thank you for inviting me here to speak and share this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sherry. So the reason that the 3 of us came together to host this webinar is because of the current review panel called NEHA that is right now examining the right to safe and adequate and affordable housing for women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people, and Canada's duty to uphold that right to housing. And this review panel that's happening right now is part of our right to housing legislation, which is enshrined in the National Housing Strategy Act. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to talk about the importance of the review panel and how to make a submission to claim your right to housing. So in 2019, the National Housing Strategy Act enshrined the right to housing legislation, and it gave us a few things. It gave us a federal housing advocate, it gave us a National Housing Council, and then it also gave the National Housing Council the ability to appoint a three-member review panel to basically what all three of these things do can dive into specific issues related to the housing and homelessness crisis in Canada with the intention of rectifying it, of fixing it, coming to the federal government and saying, here are recommendations and policies that you can do to help this specific group of people. So they've done a review, the Federal Housing Advocate's done a review on encampments. For instance, the first review panel that ever happened, because all this started in 2019. It's very, very new legislation and law. The first review panel was on the financialization and commodification, basically turning housing into a business and pricing us all out of it. And so this is the second review panel to ever happen, and it's focused on women, two-spirit, trans, gender diverse people and their right to housing. So how did we get this specific review panel? So we've got this little roadmap that we created, the Women's Network. In 2022, so just a little over 2 years ago now, almost three, the Women's Network, and we have a sister organization called the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network. We co-developed two historic human rights claims with community advocates, lived experts, scholars, groups like Kate's across the country, and submitted it to the Federal Housing Advocate. The Federal Housing Advocate then reviewed our two claims, and basically our claims showed evidence that Canada has failed to eliminate housing and homelessness crisis for women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people. The Federal Housing Advocate took our two claims and referred it to the National Housing Council. Then the National Housing Council appointed three of its members to lead a review panel on that. So that's where we are at number three. So what this review panel is doing right now is they are accepting written submissions with 5 questions to fill out. So basically a form to fill out. If you're part of an organization, you can send in a report or a study or what have you, but they're really interested in hearing from lived experts themselves. So there is a public form you can fill out that includes privacy, your consent, and your story essentially. Then they're also going to be holding oral dialogues, both virtually and in person. Don't have any information to share on that at the moment, but the written dialogue has a deadline of March 14th this year. So we still have some time. When they've collected all this evidence, the written submissions, and they're finished their oral dialogues, and they've heard from folks across the country, they are going to prepare a report with recommendations and submit that to the Minister of Housing or the minister in charge of the National Housing Strategy Act, which is usually the Minister of Housing. Then, by law that they're legislated, the minister has to respond within 120 days publicly in the House of Commons and the Senate. So this is where it's going. Right now, we're at number three in this roadmap, where the National Housing Council wants to hear from us. They want to hear from lived experts. They want to hear from folks who have been impacted, are women, two-spirit, trans, gender diverse folks who have experienced homelessness or housing precarity in all of its shapes and form. So the three appointed members have called this review panel NEHA, which will examine the right to safe, adequate, and affordable housing for women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people, and the government's duty to uphold this right. So they created this really beautiful diagram that I like to show folks to kind of help visualize what NEHA is looking for and who they're hoping to hear from. So at the very center of everything, you see rights holders. And that's you and me. That's all of us. We are all rights holders under the right to housing legislation. I mean, it's our human rights in general, of course, and specifically, this is the right to housing. So that's all of us. We're all included in that. Then in that kind of outer circle, there's rights-focused solutions, safe spaces for people with lived or living experience, inclusion, accessibility, participant and panel supports. So these are sort of the guiding values of the NAHA review panel. Then the outer circle, the darker circle where it says reason, action, vision, and knowledge. These are the guiding principles in the 5 questions, which we'll go over in this webinar. The 5 questions that the National Housing Review Council is put into their written submissions to help lived experts share their vision, their knowledge, their reasonings, and the action they would like to see or you would like to see when you're making a submission. Then the outer circle, which is always never exhaustive, but really gives you a good sense of who they'd like to hear from. So you'll see people living with disabilities, people of color from different regions, people who are unemployed or living on low or fixed income, any people or population at risk of being left behind, diverse families, youth and children, people who are or have been incarcerated. Anyway, it keeps going. I won't list every single one, and I am going to share the slide deck and recording after. But I just wanted to give a sense of how big a picture this NAHA review panel is interested in capturing when they make their recommendations and policies to the Minister of Housing. So the timeline. They opened the written submission portal on November 22nd. The portal will close on March 14th, and then the oral dialogues will be announced soon. And I believe that you don't have to necessarily make a written submission if you're interested in participating in the oral dialogue. So if a written submission isn't of interest for you at this time, there will be information on the oral dialogues that we will share, and I believe Kate and Sherry will share as well with our groups. So I'm going to pass it over to Kate to share a little bit why it's really critical to share your story right now with the review panel. Pass it over to you, Kate.
Thanks. Just in time. My computer died and I just got back on and
Oh,
then
I'm
noticed it
glad you're
was running
here.
out of steam. Anyway, I'm back in. Yeah, so one of the things that has really been concerning us, of course, is the lack of accessible housing in Canada. When Statistics Canada says 27% of people between 15 and 65 have a disability in Canada. In Ontario, it's 28%. In some other provinces, it's much higher. But there's no law in Canada requiring that any housing be accessible. So what are we to do about this? So we're really working hard to try to change things. And the only way to really get change is to have some powerful recommendations go to the government and bring attention to this. So that's why we have joined with this review panel to draw attention to the fact that women with disabilities and parents with children with disabilities are struggling harder than just about anyone to try to find affordable, accessible housing. There's a lot of talk about affordable housing, which of course we desperately need, but no talk about accessible housing. So we want to get that on the table and get change made. Australia has changed their building code. Now, any new housing of any kind, doesn't matter whether it's a mansion or subsidized housing, an apartment or a house, it has to be universal design, no matter what. They call it livable design, I think, but I got in touch and they said, oh no, it means universal design. They just thought livable might sound better to developers, but it wasn't the case. They weren't fooled. They knew. So we're hoping that many women with disabilities or with children with disabilities will make submissions to this panel so that maybe the next panel can focus specifically on the need for accessible housing. So thanks. Please do submit your submission.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I'm going to pass it over to Sherry. Oh, Sherry, you're just on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Stephanie and Kate, for your amazing work. I just wanted to share a little bit of a story about parents and caregivers of children with disabilities. If you could just go to the next slide. And really encourage everyone that, and I imagine since you're here and you're in the room, you probably understand that your voice and your stories matter, but if you could share this kind of message wider with your friends and family and within your network, that when you do speak up and share your story, it can make a difference. It's sometimes hard to see, but in Ontario, I've been doing advocacy for children and youth and caregivers for a number of years. And here you can see, sorry, in that first picture, you could see us at the Queen's Park Legislature where we took, yeah, sorry, where we took our children with disabilities down to meet with the MPPs. And it does make a difference, and it did make an impact. And because we did that advocacy, the government, I mean, it was a drop in the bucket, but the government made a substantial investment in early intervention. And I think this message to go out to all the naysayers out there that are thinking taking that time to write up your story won't affect change or won't help anything. I just want you to understand that people like Stephanie and Kate and myself, we're kind of leading the charge, but we badly need you. We need you to take those 10 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever it's going to take you to kind of type it up and engage. It can have a difference. So, and actually on this slide is Ikra and she's the MP in Mississauga, and I had the opportunity to go and meet with her today. And she is an aunt to a nephew with Down syndrome and a tremendous supporter of these kind of changes that we're asking the federal government. So on the next screen, you can see we are trying to remind the federal government that disability poverty begins at birth. So the minute that you have a child with complex needs, maybe it's medical, it could be severe behavioral disabilities, you're often forced out of the workforce. So if you go to the last slide, I'm going to do this quickly, Stephanie. I promise. What we did was an audit of all federal government policies, and we found that I think by design, and it's maybe because federal policy writers just don't hear enough from families. They're not hearing our stories, or maybe it's by design. They're trying to cut corners and save money. So they assume if you're a parent and you have a child, that you can provide for that child. And all the policies are set up to kind of exclude parents. So children with severe and prolonged disabilities and their caregivers are really excluded at every program. There's not one program that would really support us and list us out of poverty or lower social economic status, which would then mean that we have, without that, we have home housing insecurity and no accessible housing. So there's barriers to our employment, which means we also have barriers to workplace benefits. And we also cannot make CPP contributions because we are home doing full-time caregiving. And when you're either doing that care or you're arranging that care with other caregivers or other clinics, my daughter just, maybe I should have given this at the beginning, but my daughter has multiple disabilities. And she has a wheelchair, she has a feeding tube, she has an iPad to communicate. She's 20 and she still goes to a modified school day. So the bus comes and gets her like at 9:07 and brings her home at 2:30. So if you can imagine trying to find a job in those few hours of the day is literally impossible. And then when the government, so that's employment income, and then the government rolled out the Canada Recovery Caregiver Benefit. You would think caregivers, hey, there's something for us. No, you had to been employed the year before. So for many lifetime caregivers, we've had to leave the workforce literally at their birth, or because of medical appointments. It's really hard, even when they go to school, for them to go to school part-time or to take them to treatment to work. But that program came out and excluded us. Then the government rolled out the child care benefit, but daycare centers are not obligated to accept children with disabilities, and they're not resourced with the extra funds or supports, and they can just say, we're sorry, but your child, they just can't accommodate it. And parents find it very hard for their child to be accepted in daycare systems, which is another barrier to employment. And then in 2023, the federal government rolled out a multi-generational home renovation tax credit to help us make our homes accessible. However, this tax credit, which is a credit, so that's only helpful if you're working and you have the money to do the renovation, the costly renovation. But even that, small credit was only if your child was 18 or above. And I have a child with a physical disability. She's 19. I cannot wait until she's 18 to make a home accessible for her. So parents of teenagers, even 12-year-olds, they get quite big in wheelchairs and they're lifting their children into the home. They're lifting them. I have to carry my daughter up the stairs at night. It is very hard. And I think policymakers, I'm not sure, why are they doing that? They're not, I feel like they're doing it because they're not hearing from enough of us, and it keeps costs down for them. And then the next thing is the existing EI caregiver benefit, which is for the federal government recognizes that if something happens to your child, and let's say they get, or it could be your child, it could be a parent, you have to leave the workforce, and they want to pay for them. However, your child cannot have a pre-existing condition to qualify for this. So we found that all the policies specifically exclude caregivers, and that's pushing caregivers into lower social economic status and to housing insecurities. And thank you, Stephanie, for letting us share these concerns.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sherry. I think hearing from you was so important from both of you because it's just um, to show that these are the sort of folks that and stories that I know the NEHA review panel is very interested in hearing from. When we were looking at those circles, these are experiences that, as Sherry put so well, the government isn't always hearing from, or they are, but um, they need more, it seems like. It just seems like they need more. And what all of this is doing is creating this public record. It's creating all this evidence that the right to housing isn't, it's not being exercised. It's not, it's basically failing at the moment. The government is failing to uphold it, pardon me. And so when we think about making our submission, the NEHA review panel has put together an online form. And I'll go over how you can submit next. Right now, I thought it would be helpful to go over the 5 questions posed by the NEHA review panel to help you make your submission. So you're not just looking at a blank slate and starting from scratch. And I also love how these questions have been formed because you also don't necessarily have to relive your traumatic experiences and write them out because this is really about telling the NEHA review panel what the problems are and what you've experienced. Somewhat like what Sherry's done for us, how she broke down specific policies and how they're failing her family and her daughter. So the first question, sorry, I'm just going to move the first question is vision. What is your vision for safe, adequate, and affordable housing for women, two-spirit trans, and gender diverse people? For example, what are your hopes and dreams for yourself, your family, your community, and for future generations? What is your vision for all women, two-spirit trans, and gender diverse people now and for generations to come? Of course, you don't have to answer that for if you identify as a woman. You don't have to answer that for two-spirit trans and gender diverse folks. It's meant to open up that question to be inclusive. So when people see these questions, they see themselves in it. And I also really just want to stress that there are no wrong answers. Um, these all of these questions and all of your answers are deeply personal. And from my experience, since I've been, well, I was actually a journalist for 10 years and then got into advocacy in the homelessness and housing sector about 7 years ago. And throughout both of those career paths, people who have that lived experience and lived expertise know the system better than any expert out there, any scholar, any educator, whatever you want to put it, professional that works in this space. People who have been subjected to the system know it best. And I think what these review panel questions really opens up the playing field for people with lived experience of housing insecurity and homelessness to share all of those wrongs in the system better than anybody else. So this first one is really what what does the right to housing look like for you, your community, however you want to answer that question? It's very, very open-ended. But what do you see? Um, like what's your ideal and how do we get there basically? Number two, what knowledge can be used to inform or support this vision? This is that sort of how do we get there? In your experience, what has helped to support you or others in your community to secure safe, adequate, and affordable housing? What hasn't helped? Do you have research reports or other evidence that support your proposed vision? Also, I've had this question come up a few times as we've been talking about this form. You don't necessarily have to have research reports or other evidence to support your proposed vision. If you feel like that's an overwhelming sort of task, that's okay. If you do want to do that, but not quite sure how, you can always reach out to the Women's Network. We've developed a toolkit to help folks fill out this form as well. So again, look at these questions as open-ended and how you want to answer them. There's no wrong answers. Reason. Why is this vision important? For example, what is preventing access to safe, adequate, and affordable housing for women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people? How does this lack of access affect you, your family, and your community? Sherry, I feel like this recording of you talking, I could make a submission right now based on just what you shared. Um,
For it.
right? And how would things be different if this vision were realized? Question four, action. What actions are needed to make this vision a reality? For example, what actions are needed to make a home for yourself or your family? What can women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people do to claim their right to safe, adequate, and affordable housing? What actions should be taken by governments, service providers, and others who have the power to make a difference? So, even though this is technically going to the federal government, I don't want folks to feel limited, and neither does the NAHA review panel. I believe when they say governments, all levels. So, what could your local government be doing better? What could your provincial or territorial government be doing better? And of course, what could the federal government be doing better as well? So, if you as Sherry was sort of stepping us through those policies that and how they're failing, you can kind of pinpoint, okay, this is a federal government policy, and this is how it could be delivered better. Or maybe there's a service provider that you work with, and there are these weird, like bureaucratic barriers that pop up. This is an opportunity to name them. And how do we remove the barrier as well? And then the fifth question, like any good question and answer, I love these kinds of questions. Is there anything else you want us to know about you to understand your comments better? Or, what weren't you able to express in the first four questions that you can now talk about in this fifth, more open-ended question? What else do we need to hear to rectify the right to housing for women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people? For yourself, right? So there are, until March 14th, there are 3 ways to submit to NAHA. And when I share the slide deck with everyone, these are all active links. So you'll be able to link directly to all of this. So the 5 questions I just went through, there is an online form, number one, for an online submission right away. Just note that if you do an online submission, you do need to sit down and do it all at once. You can't really stop and save. So that's when you're sort of like ready to go. You're sitting down and you're filling it out. The second way, this one gives you more time, is an email submission. So maybe you don't want to sit down and answer those 5 questions all at once. Totally okay. Neha has done a really great job to make this as accessible as possible. You can download the form and you can either complete it in the text text box provided or as a separate email attachment, and then you can email them. And then number 3, if this is easier, you can download and print and complete the form by hand and mail in your submission, and there's the information for that as well. So there's a few things as well, and this goes for Kate and Sherry through their networks too. If you would end up sharing your story and you feel so inclined and want to encourage others to do the same, at the Women's Network, we've created a website where you can share your story with us with your personal information redacted. But if you share the testimony with us, we'd be happy to. We're making sort of a living public sort of space where we're posting this. I know the NEHA review panel. When you fill out the form, there's the privacy notice and the consent. I believe they're also creating a public space for doing this as well. So the purpose of that is so people see that, maybe they were on the fence about making a submission. They're like, I don't know if they want to hear from me. I don't know if I qualify to share my story. Just know you absolutely do. And the purpose of sharing that public record is to encourage people to do it as well, or to maybe see their story and other people's stories. And of course, perhaps maybe they don't do a written submission, but they see your written submissions and they're like, okay, I'm going to participate, in the oral dialogue, which is another avenue that we'll be able to learn more about soon once it's announced, to participate virtually or in person. So I'm going to stop there and open up for questions. I think I'll stop sharing if that's okay with everyone. And oh, I already see someone's hand raised, so I'll start with you, Cindy.
Good morning, everybody. I was wondering, I've developed a thesis based on, I'm my own case study. So I'm a survivor of a violent domestic incident that happened a while back. But in my thesis, I kind of give a background. So I say that domestic violence disproportionately affects marginalized communities, including Indigenous populations, highlighted the need for cultural sensitive and responsive support services. The Victims of Crime Act and the Victim Bill of Rights establish the rights of victims, including the right to information, participation, and protection. However, systemic barriers often prevent victims from accessing these rights fully. Housing insecurity is a pervasive issue for survivors of domestic violence, exacerbated by systemic discrimination in housing markets. Survivors often face economic barriers such as unemployment and the lack of affordable housing, which makes it difficult to secure safe, long-term, and permanent housing. The relationship between housing insecurity, homelessness, and domestic violence is complex, with survivors often forced to choose between remaining in an abusive situation or facing homelessness. Now, that's just a snippet of my overall thesis. But in my thesis, I've been advocating on behalf of myself, and I'm going through the discriminations, the barriers. I have contacted the ministers in Alberta. So in my thesis, I have an analysis and discussion as well as implication and recommendation. And I'm saying reforming housing assistance program to ensure that they are inclusive and responsive to the needs of those fleeing violence, removing barriers that inadvertently exclude victims from accessing vital resources. So I know there's barriers, like with homelessness here in Alberta. You have to be homeless for 1 year to even be considered in some of these housing programs. So it inadvertently discriminates women who are still on the verge of fleeing, or because there's not enough shelters here in Edmonton, that there's a long 30,000. There's a report issued by the Alberta Women's Shelter, and in that report, it states between 20 and 30,000 women are getting they can't they don't have enough room to accommodate these women fleeing domestic violence. But my issue is what a choice a woman has to make between returning to their abusers or becoming homeless. What a choice a woman has to make, right? So I am going to submit my own story and my thesis. I've been advocating for almost 2 years now, and it goes to deaf ears provincially, federally, municipally, right? So I'm still going to submit it, and hopefully we can get some more housing, affordable housing, specifically for women who are fleeing domestic violence. But it was more of a comment than a question.
No, that's great. And yeah, Cindy, you can, there's a couple ways you can do it. So they're only, I should note, the NEHA review panel is only accepting one submission per person. So you can fill out the form and use your thesis and like pull evidence from it to one of the questions that calls for that. Or I believe NEHA also has a form you can fill out if you and send along like your thesis as a report as well.
Right, right,
So I would look into the different ways you can do that. You can fill out the personal form and use your thesis and the evidence that you've built, or submit it sort of as repurpose it a little bit, of course.
right,
But
right.
yeah,
And
no,
I
that's
also
really great.
list, like through my own experience, I've also listed the barriers that I've faced
Yeah,
trying to get housing, right?
yeah. No, that's great. I'm really glad you're making a submission. Thank you for sharing
Oh,
that.
yes, thank you.
Yeah. And next, the next hand I see is Joel.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering how my organization could connect to maybe join the Accessible Housing Network. I'm an adult protective service worker.
That's a great question. Kate, do you want to?
Yeah, you can send us an email, accessiblehousing@gmail.com, telling us a wee bit about your organization and saying you'd like to join, and then we'll follow up with you. What
Perfect.
happens is each organization sends one or maybe two representatives to our steering committee meetings, and we meet online on Zoom once a month for about an hour. And then other things that are happening, smaller groups continue to work in between meetings, but the actual steering committee meeting is just for about an hour. So send us an email, accessiblehousing@gmail.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then I was also wondering if the presentation today will be sent to us.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm recording the presentation and I'll share a link to that. And then I'll be PDFing the slide deck and sharing it with everybody who registered too.
Amazing. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Joel. And the next question I have is from Ingrid, or sorry, hand up that I see is Ingrid. Oh, you're just on mute. Sorry, Ingrid. Zoom.
Hi, I'm the Community Support Coordinator for Hydrocephalus Canada, and our office is in Toronto, but I live in Burlington. Now, for people who are going to be making submissions, is this open for everybody across Canada or just Toronto? I thought I saw just Toronto.
Across Canada. No, not at all. Yes. No, great question. I'd love to clarify things like this. So it's open to anyone across Canada. So whether it be organizations sending in like a report or a study, or individuals. The sort of focus though is, if it's individual, is that it's women, two-spirit, trans, or gender diverse people. If you are a man, you can support somebody to help make a submission, of course, if you're interested, because I do see men in the chat today, and I don't want you to feel totally excluded in this process. But yes, the focus is hearing from women, two-spirit, trans, gender diverse people from across Canada.
Okay, and sorry, I have kind of three questions
No,
related.
please, yeah.
Shauna also put something out for me. If I have a couple of people in mind who are already living in accessible housing, is it fine for them to make this submission as well?
Yes,
Or-
absolutely. Yeah, lived or living experience. So even though perhaps there's someone who has found housing and living in that now, they still have a story to share. And I'm sure they have insights on how this could have been a way better process for them. Yeah.
And also, now I'll just move into Shauna's observations, but also
Hmm.
my own. Now, Toronto has a huge waiting list on affordable housing, and
Yes.
places like Burlington have no affordable housing, essentially.
Hmm.
But back to Toronto, since it has the 5 to 10 year waiting list, will that be addressed at all? Like, it's wonderful that the government is formulating these new committees or commissions. And it
Yeah.
seems that whenever there's a change in government, or whenever there's about to be a new government or a potential new government, they throw out these studies and these committees to do studies, but they
Yeah.
really don't address things that are currently happening, such as the long waiting list. So,
Hmm.
will we get both things? Will we get this new committee focusing in on individual submissions, plus maybe this committee looking back at the crisis points that are currently happening?
Hmm. Yeah. So, okay. So I'm going to take a step back to answer your question. So, the right to housing legislation that's led to this review panel, National Housing Council, they're basically, and the Federal Housing Advocate, they're very much watchdogs on the right to housing. So, we sort of like, I live in BC, we have a watchdog for, the children and youth ministry. And so that advocate and the Federal Housing Advocate, it does this as well. They review an issue, they come up with recommendations, and it's another report presented to that government, which tends to like get thrown on the pile, creates a body of evidence that can often and does lead to litigation. So that's sort of where we see this going. If because what's different here with the review panel and the right to housing legislation is when these reports and recommendations are made, the Minister of Housing has to respond publicly on record, the House of Commons and the Senate. So there has to be a response of some kind. So far, the response has been, I'm going to be really, really honest, it has been disappointing with the first two that we've seen with encampments and financialization. It was basically just kind of a like, here's all the things we've done so far, right? Like a rehash of promises and small tasks that have been done. We at the Women's Network, as I mentioned much earlier, we have a sister organization, the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network. Our co-chair, who's with our network and that network, she's our Indigenous elder, and she's put this in perspective because that can feel really disheartening when it's like, here's another thing, we're collecting our stories, we're putting it forward to go where? Big question mark, right? And it can be really disheartening and really like demoralizing. But she's like, this is creating a really critical public record because this has never been so exhaustively looked at before in Canadian history, this particular issue on gender and housing rights. And the way the right to housing legislation is written is it does open up the federal government to litigation, to be sued over it as a rights claim, which then generally through the court system actually leads to really important changes. And we're seeing that in other sort of spaces where we're winning really important rights issues against the government, which forces them to make the changes that we're doing. So that's a really, really, really big response. I apologize.
Problem.
My point being, I really encourage you to still submit make these submissions, including all of this, talking about the wait list, because people are dying on these wait lists across gender, men, women, two-spirit, everybody. It's really important that we have this public record because the more it happens in the dark, the easier it is to be swept under the rug. What this review panel does is it really shines the strongest bright light we have as like a bureaucratic legal mechanism that we have right now for housing rights to take us to that next step where if it's another really disappointing response, which, sometimes you have to prepare yourself, the fight doesn't end there for us. We have this huge public record, all of these critical stories, and we're going to take it farther. Kate, I saw you unmute yourself. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's really important to have a historical perspective. I'm a raging granny, and we have a song where we say, talking about the right to protest, that if we didn't protest, there'd be small children still working in the mines here. Children would not have school. Women would not have the vote, on and on. All the things, we'd still have slavery here. I know a lot of these things are still happening in the rest of the world, but it's because people stood up and fought that we got the progress, however much it is that we have. And we need to remember that and keep fighting.
Thank you, Kate. I love that. I love Raging Grannies so much. I look forward to joining your ranks one day. But yes, sorry. My point being, sorry, Raging Grannies totally distracted me. We never had a National Housing Strategy Act. It came from, just like Kate said, a lot of forceful advocacy and pushing because there's just a point where it's only going to get worse. We have to hold the line somewhere. And so what this process does is it holds the line and helps us push forward where we can and make and lead to those big achievements that Kate listed, right?
Yeah.
Ingrid, was that all your questions or did you have
Well,
more?
just one quick, and this goes back to someone already who shared her personal story regarding homelessness. I just had a general question because I do, like every other city, we have shelters for women, and I was updating my bus pass because I don't drive because I have peripheral vision damage, and I was updating my bus pass, and this man, very noticeably distressed. He was trying to get help for his sister, who was there with essentially everything she owned, her luggage. And he was looking for a space for her. And I think she had just come out of the shelter because you can only stay at a shelter for so long. So if you're talking about women only being eligible for accessible and affordable housing after a year, what's available to them if they're kicked out of a shelter? Like, where do they go?
Yep. That's the critical question. And I think these are the sort of things, and I will speak to the NAHA review panel members. These are experienced, lived experts. This is strongly Indigenous led as well, who've experienced the system firsthand for themselves. So we are getting review panel members who definitely understand the breadth and scope of the issue, which is why they've cast such a wide net on who they want to hear from. But yeah, these are the sort of things that they'll be making recommendations on sort of creating the proper path and covering the spectrum of housing that's required to meet the needs of people right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid. Alessia, you're next on my list.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation and for letting me speak. I just thought that I had more like a comment and a question.
Sure.
And I'm still trying to figure out kind of the hierarchy of all these acronyms, but
Sure.
It's, as someone who works in accessible and inclusive design, I'm wondering if feedback could be provided to NEHA. My concern is that it sounds like their submissions are only being accepted in written format. And so I think that can be a barrier to a lot of people. And it sounds like it's only in English. And I think that if we're looking to get a true scope and a wide net of people's lived experiences, obviously my focus is women with disabilities, but things like video submissions, or I don't know, art pieces or submissions in other languages. I think that they would generate a different story. And so I'm thinking that this might limit a lot of the responses. And maybe that's something that your organization can support in, like, I don't know, it just feels like it's a little exclusionary
Mm,
when there's so many voices that don't translate as well in written format that are
mhm.
equally as powerful. So that's kind of like my comment. And my question is, I don't, could you kind of outline then what happens after the March deadline?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I could actually address a little bit of your comment. So this is a little bit my fault for not sharing all the details, but they are accepting in English and French for sure. I think if you submit in another language, the review panel, yeah, there might be something there we can ask what the sort of ability of their translation services are. And then also at the Women's Network, if someone wanted to submit, but the written submission is in their way, one of the services that we're providing is if somebody records themselves or makes a recording, like an oral recording, we can help transcribe and help that person submit. So if you or know anyone else, please, please, please contact our network and we will help support that. I didn't mention it in this webinar, but there is also an opportunity. My network is putting out something called Community Champion Program, where folks are welcome to sign up if you have lived or living experience, although that's not super critical. But essentially, you can sign up for this Community Champion Program. We have an honoraria and like one training session we ask you to attend, where we sort of train you to go into your community and help up to 5 people make a submission. So you get an honoraria, and each person who submits also gets an honoraria. And that's where we can really then be there and give you that support. You're kind of connected in with us. I will share the link in a second to that, the sign up link. And I can, if you have, questions on like what the honoraria looks like, we can talk about that and what the support looks like. We're a very, very tiny team at the Women's Network, but this is a really huge focus for us because the National Housing Council, the review panel, these are still kind of embedded in government. They're their own thing, they're their own independent watchdog thing, but they're also limited by what they can do. And because this whole thing is based on our 2 human rights claims, we're really, 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 really focused on making this as accessible as we can with our limitations, of course, or working case by case to get as many people to send in a submission as humanly possible. So thank you for asking that, Alessia, because yes, I should have mentioned that earlier. Um, Secondly, to actually answer your actual question, is the written submissions, March 14th deadline, there will be some oral dialogues that happen virtually and in person. Emily with the National Housing Council, like secretariat, they're called, sort of the behind the scenes office bureaucrat folks that are supporting that work of the appointed members. She was saying that's going to be a bit limited by, I guess, how many people can sign up and join in. They're still figuring out what it looks like. Anyway, once the oral dialogues are done, the written submissions are done, the review panel takes it all in and they create a pile of recommendations and policies and give it to the Minister of Housing. Within 120 days of receiving that recommendations, the Minister of Housing has to respond within that 120 days in the House of Commons and in the Senate. Now, that response can look any which way. It can be a letter, it can be a commitment to making these recommendations happen. Either way, if it's a disappointing outcome, like we don't get the response that we want, oh, thank you, Kate, you're amazing. If we don't get the response that we want, the next step with this body of evidence is to pursue litigation. Okay, awesome. The next hand I see up is Danielle.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this. Just two questions. One, so I'm Indigenous and I live with a disability. I do a lot of work in disability justice advocacy, and I'm also a sexual assault survivor. Are there any kind of tips on sort of like helping to incorporate that kind of intersectionality into a submission so that our message is really staying effective and on point?
Yes, that's an amazing question, Danielle, and thank you for sharing. We at the Women's Network, I'll share the link in the chat, but we developed a toolkit to sort of help folks make a submission. Like maybe they don't know where to start, or maybe they just need help organizing their thoughts. So we've created like templates you can fill out to do that. We also link all of our research and studies if you want to include like statistics and data to back up some of your points. We have all of that. Would that be helpful to share with you?
Yeah, that I think that'd be amazing.
Okay, great. Yeah, and then of course, like if you want to go beyond that, I've shared my email and such. So really strongly encourage people to reach out to us as well directly.
Okay, great. And my second question is so I've actually lost my housing a number of times. Once to a landlord that actually tried to get me to defraud the city.
Oh boy.
They were dealing with fire inspections because I didn't know rooming houses were illegal in North York.
Wow.
And so they tried to put my stuff in a U-Haul and have me stay in a hotel while the inspection was being completed, and then to move me back in. And so obviously knowing that this was realizing this was how unsafe this was, I did what I thought was right and I cooperated with the fire department. And the end result was it was ruled as a immediate risk to life, and not only myself but 7 other people lost our housing, and we were not supported at all. So we were all made homeless. And now currently, I'm facing an N13 eviction in bad faith. And as a person with a disability, I can't tell you how devastating this is.
Yeah.
Nothing's been filed with the LTB board. No permits have been filed with the city. I've tried my best to get legal support. However, their advice is because there's no hearing date because nothing's been filed. I'm just supposed to sit and wait till this thing expires while they're actively threatening me. And so they
Mhm.
basically kind of laugh at these checks and balances. They're really mocking them. Well, they're doing all of this, and I really it just speaks to when you get right down to the root of it, the way that people are not supported in accessing their rights. And I wanted to
Yeah.
use this sort of like a base to kind of inform part of my submission because
Yeah.
rights are basically operating more as a privilege than as something that everyone is and should have access to. Um, but yeah, because who really is suffering at the end of this if someone fits and says no, I'm not going to move out because this wasn't filed properly, this isn't fair, this isn't right.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask, or if there are any sort of like considerations that I should make in referencing anything like this, considering like, especially with the N13, that it's actively ongoing, like I'm in the middle of it. And if there's
Mhm.
anything I should take in consideration in sort of bringing that into the submission. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I maybe you don't realize how eloquent you speak, but I feel like even just you describing your situation to me right now is um that's a submission. Like these are, when we were going through the 5 questions, if you saw that, it really opens up to you. Like I said, there's no wrong way to answer those questions. Neha will be taking in those answers very seriously, no matter how they're organized. So I would say really describing your situation. And if you have ideas on like how this could be fixed, under vision or under reason, you can sort of lay out your situation and then talk about, because the unfairness and the failure of the right to housing is very evident. So you don't have to really justify why your situation is a failure of the right to housing. I would say go into if you have the recommendations or you know what if there was this like policy, or if this person existed, this would fix your situation. I would include things like that. That'd be a consideration. But otherwise, I think really, really stepping through your situation is a really, and I'm sorry, an unfortunate example of the failure of the right to housing, because you should be protected in your situation as a tenant. Like, you'd have way more rights than, yeah, than what's being allowed to you right now in your situation. So I'm very sorry, but thank you for being here and for sharing that. And I will share the toolkit in the chat. And I will also email it out. I'll include the community champion sign up link that Kate shared for me, and I'll include the toolkit as well, which is in English and French.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you, Danielle. Tara.
Hi, I actually had two questions, but you're doing such a great job that you've already answered one.
Okay.
Um, so I'm sure this is in the toolkit, but I was wondering, when you're going through the questions, you were sort of saying how we should talk about the barriers to housing. Now, is it better to sort of concentrate on the main barrier, or should we sort of list all of them? What do you recommend?
Honestly, it's up to you. Like I said, I'm just a little reluctant to tell you exactly the best way to do it, because the best way is what you think is the best answer. So if it's really onerous to list every single barrier, that's absolutely okay if you want to prioritize them. Because the idea is that we'll see so many submissions that hopefully we'll see maybe the barriers you leave out will be in somebody else's submission, that kind of thing. But it's really up to you whether you want to prioritize or if you want to list them all. I would go by, if I were you, I would go by what I felt like I had the capacity for. If that's helpful.
Thank you. No, that's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Tara. Peggy.
Hi. I'm having problems with my bandwidth and I'm not feeling great. And you already froze up on me a couple of times. So,
Oh,
Stephanie,
sorry, Peggy.
no, it's not your fault. It's my problem here, my end. It's just one of those days. But I too live in Burlington. So Halton does have affordable housing. Not a lot of it. Where I live in my complex, which has, I think, about 140 units, 4 of them are accessible. And so I live for over 32 years now with a physical disability from a work-related injury, which, I did manage after some surgeries and some physio. I did manage to go back to work after about 8 years. And then I got very, very ill, and we didn't know what was wrong with me. But anyways, it comes down to the fact that I was diagnosed with a rare disease where basically I'm allergic to the world. And so I have to live in a totally self-contained unit. And I did become homeless and trying to figure out the second thing that was going on with me, because I was already physically disabled, right? And so, the employer wasn't willing to make a lot more accommodations for me at that point, and they weren't highly motivated to. So, I lost my job, I lost my housing. I did go into successfully a second stage housing unit in Hamilton. But I went through a lot of rigmarole to get into this unit. That's not an accessible unit, but it's a totally self-contained unit. So I don't have to use my EpiPen every day. I don't experience anaphylaxis attacks every day. So that's a good thing. But it's a completely inaccessible housing to me. I have 18 stairs in the unit to go up and down to washroom and second floor. The outside of the complex was not taken care of for decades. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I injured myself severely outside. with a fall. And I've been sleeping upright in a chair for 4.5 years as a result of these injuries, because I'm waiting for neck interventions as well as hand surgeries. But anyways, I'm just saying that from going from second stage housing, I managed to get back to Halton from Hamilton, go into a basement apartment, only to, which is still precarious housing. I don't care if I had a lease, if it was my own apartment with my own bedroom or whatever. The landlord lived upstairs. She never respected my privacy. She never respected my space. At the end of the day, she just, as went like all the landlords, oh, I can get more money, so I'm gonna evict you. But she started with, well, she was thinking about selling the house. Anyways, long story short is, really the legal clinic here didn't do a very good job representing me, because as a person with a disability, they could have done a whole lot more for me. And had they, I would have been in one of those accessible units, because one became available within 3 months of me moving in here. But after I'd spent already, I don't know, $2,000 that I didn't really have, and nowhere else to go to find any more money, I couldn't pay the property management $200 and then pay another $2,000 to be packed up again and moved again and unpacked again, because I had to pay people to unpack me. So unpack me. So I sit here and I say, I have these significant injuries. I'm waiting on surgery for my hands and my neck. I can't type, I can't write, I can't submit in that way.
Sure. Yeah.
But I am a part of Advancement Women of Halton and have been for 10 years. I've been a longtime community advocate, a former school board trustee, public school board trustee, along with, I was the vice chair of the board. Along with, I worked in children's mental health, and I was also, previous to that, the clerk for the administrative and associate chief justice of the province. I'm a paralegal as well as a trained wraparound facilitator. I'm no slouch, but I am where I am.
Yeah.
And I'm treated as a slouch. It's terrible.
Yeah.
And so I'm sorry, I'm getting a little emotional, because I'm thinking of all the people I've been listening to, and I think I got a little triggered, and I'm sorry about that.
No, that's absolutely fair, Peggy. And if you are facing those barriers to submit, just in case you
Yeah,
didn't hear
I'm
me say
facing
this earlier.
barriers to submitting, and then,
Yeah.
I think it's important that somehow, because what I haven't heard about is invisible disabilities here.
Mm,
And I think it's important that we talk about people with invisible disabilities and what they need.
yeah.
I don't think we think about that a lot when we
Yeah.
talk about disabilities. So that's really why I wanted to talk today. So
Yeah.
I leave that with you. And if you want to get back to me, you have my email, and I'm happy to provide you with my phone number, and we can talk about things a little at some
Sure.
point. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you,
Take
Peggy.
care. Thank you.
Yeah. And I was just going to add, Peggy, that when I send the email, it'll be from my following up with all of you and everyone who registered. It'll be from my work email. So, which also has, like, in my signature, has my phone number. So, Peggy, if you respond to that email, we can set something up, and I'm happy to help you make a
Okay.
submission.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because even with Advancement Women of Halton, I can tell you we're up to our eyeballs, and
sure.
I
Yeah,
don't think I could go to even my working group that would look at
for
this
help.
around housing
Yeah.
and ask them to take on another project. Like, they just couldn't. So,
No, that's
okay,
totally
thank you
okay.
very much.
Yeah, and that's the purpose of today, is to let folks know that A, this is happening, and that my network and Kate and Sherry are all here to help with those submissions. So when I send that email, please, feel free to respond if you need, if you would like to set something up to make a submission, or for the Women's Network to support that. Sean.
So thank you, Stephanie and Peggy. I can kind of sympathize a little bit with the invisible disabilities because I have one myself, actually. Just want to let you know a bit about myself before going to what I want to say. I'm from Brampton, and I'm with Brampton County Community Living on the board of directors, and I'm also with Community Living Ontario. Um, so that being said, just want to mention that I work at Home Depot part-time. And we actually have an initiative going on right now. It's called the Orange Door Project, and it's to try and help end youth homelessness right now.
Yeah.
And we usually raise quite a bit of money for the Orange Door Project. It usually goes very well, actually. It's
It's a
usually
great
$2.
program.
It is a
Yeah.
good program, and it's usually $2 donation. If you can donate more, that's always great. But
Mhm.
it's money where we can get it, so
Yeah.
it's good to have. And I've not experienced homelessness, but I think I've come very close because I rent right now, and I'm with Pure Living, and Pure Living isn't all that great to begin with. Um, it's affordable housing and it's subsidized housing, but it's below par for a lot of people. And when you're trying to get new appliances or even new furniture, it's often fighting tooth and nail with these guys to try and get just even some basics that you need, like maybe a new stove or a new fridge.
Yeah.
It's very difficult in that way, and it's unfortunate. It shouldn't be that way, but that's just the way it is, though, with these guys. So I can very much identify with difficulties of being developmentally challenged and facing challenges in other ways with housing. It's tough. It's very tough. And the problem is they keep increasing the rent, but the services just are either there, but they take a long time to respond. Sometimes they're just not there at all. And the ODSP system too is not that great because it works. It's just that it's below par itself because you're well below the poverty line with a terror disability. Someone said to me, it's a system that's designed to fail. You cannot get ahead with the system. It's just impossible to because
Yeah.
they don't cover some of the basics for dental. They cover some of the basics, but not everything though. So it's hard. It's very difficult.
Well, thank you, Sean. And thank you for attending today. I really, really appreciate it. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off at all. Was that
It's okay.
the end of your
Yeah.
comment or did you? Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you all so very much for having me attend today. It's been wonderful so far. It's been a wonderful experience hearing everybody's stories. Um, and I'd like to get more involved. I'd also like to have more of these conversations. I'd like to be included more if I could, if it's possible. It'd be great.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I respond, because I saw your question in the chat, so Kate, I think may have already answered you, but I'll include how to get involved with the Accessible Housing Network,
Yeah,
how to get in
she did
touch
answer
with
that.
Kate.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a wonderful network.
I'm sure it is. Thank you very much. And just
Thank you,
also, I
Sean.
have a lot of respect for Indigenous peoples. I love their culture. It's an amazing culture.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Uh, and the last hand up I see is Cindy.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a follow-up comment to Ingrid. Our population in Edmonton will reach 1,550,000 people. Of that population, half are women. I can tell you in the city of Edmonton, there's only 4 shelters. All are religious based. The max you can stay at a shelter is 45 days. However, because there's so much influx because Alberta is listed as the highest population of domestic violence, it leaves other women to accessing shelters. So there's only 4. So again, they have to make that decision. Do I stay in an abusive relationship or do I become homeless? Because there's not the capacity nor enough shelters to fit the population, you're going to overlook certain women where they now do become homeless. And I've seen it time and time again where it's more dangerous living in encampments than it is in shelters. In general, in Edmonton, these shelters are unsafe for women. So I just wanted to follow up with Ingrid.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Well, we're 15 past, so I appreciate everybody who's still in the room with us, and I'm going to call the webinar ending here, and just thank everyone again for sharing your comments, for staying with us to the very end. I will be following up in an email in the next day or so once video is up on our YouTube channel. So I'll share the link. I will share the community champion sign up, the toolkit, how to join the Accessible Housing Network, and the slide deck as well that you saw today. So I just wanted to thank everyone for your time, and it was really lovely to get to know so many of you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, Stephanie.
you.
Thanks to
Thanks,
everyone too
Sherry.
for
Thanks, Kate.
sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, great job, everybody.
Thank you.